The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered like a dying pulse, casting long shadows across the sterile hallway where Dr. Marcus Tate stood, his hands trembling with rage. He'd just been told Rialito abandon the case of Ethan Caldwell, the 16-year-old son of a millionaire whose name adorned half the buildings in this city. He's too far gone, the chief administrator had said, his voice clipped, as if Ethan's life was just another line item to be crossed off. Marcus wasn't buying it. He'd seen the scans, the charts, the boy's vitals slipping but not irretrievable. Ethan had been in a car accident, a mangled wreck that left him with a fractured skull and internal bleeding, and the hospital's elite surgical team had all but written him off. Too risky, they said. Not enough staff. But Marcus, a black surgeon who'd clawed his way through decades of prejudice to earn his place in this hospital, knew the truth: Ethan's case wasn't hopeless. It was just inconvenient. The boy's father, Richard Caldwell, had enemies in high places, and whispers of "let him go" floated through the boardroom like poison gas. Across town, in a crumbling apartment block where the heat barely worked, 15-year-old Jamal Carter sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by dog-eared medical textbooks. His mother, a night shift nurse, had taught him to read X-rays before he could ride a bike. Jamal wasn't supposed to be here, not in this story, not in this fight. But he'd overheard his mom's frantic phone call with Marcus, her old friend from med school, about a boy the hospital was giving up on. Jamal's heart raced as he pieced it together: they were letting Ethan die because of politics, because of who his father was, and maybe, just maybe, because Marcus was black and pushing too hard against the system. Jamal wasn't naive. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where equality was a word people threw around but never lived. He'd seen his mother passed over for promotions, heard the slurs muttered under breath when she walked through the hospital. He'd felt the sting of being followed in stores, of teachers assuming he'd fail before he even tried. But Jamal had something nobody could take: a mind sharper than the scalpels his mother wielded, and a fire in his chest that burned hotter than the hate he'd faced. By midnight, Jamal had made up his mind. He slipped into his mom's scrubs, too big but close enough, and stuffed her spare medical bag with supplies he'd memorized from her stories: sutures, gauze, a stolen vial of epinephrine. He didn't have a plan, not really, just a gut feeling that he could help. The hospital was a 30-minute bus ride away, and every second felt like a countdown. He didn't tell his mom. She'd kill him if she knew. The hospital's emergency entrance was chaos: paramedics shouting, gurneys clattering, families weeping in corners. Jamal slipped through, his heart pounding so loud he thought it'd give him away. He found Marcus in a break room, hunched over a coffee cup, his face etched with defeat. "Dr. Tate," Jamal whispered, his voice barely steady. Marcus's eyes snapped up, shock giving way to recognition. "Jamal. What the hell are you doing here? I heard you. On the phone. They're letting that kid die." Jamal's words tumbled out, fierce and unpolished. "I can help. I know the procedure, at least, I think I do. From Mom's books." Marcus stared, his mind racing. This was insane. Jamal was a kid, not even old enough to drive, let alone assist in a surgery the hospital's best had abandoned. But Marcus had no one else. The surgical team was on orders to stand down, and every minute brought Ethan closer to death. Against every ounce of his better judgment, Marcus nodded. "You stay quiet, and you do exactly what I say. You got that?" They moved fast, sneaking into a disused operating room in the hospital's older wing. Ethan lay on the table, pale as the sheets beneath him, his breathing shallow. The monitors beeped erratically, each sound a reminder of the ticking clock. Jamal's hands shook as he handed Marcus instruments, his mind racing to recall every page he'd studied. Marcus worked with precision, but the tension between them was electric. Two black men, one a veteran surgeon, the other a kid with no business being there, defying a system that had already written them both off. Outside, the hospital wasn't asleep. Administrator Gerald Hayes, a man whose suit cost more than Jamal's rent, had caught wind of Marcus's defiance. Hayes was Caldwell's man, loyal to the Millionaire's rivals who wanted Ethan's case buried. He stormed through the halls, his face red with fury, barking orders to security. "Find Tate. Shut this down. Now." The confrontation came faster than either Marcus or Jamal expected. Hayes burst into the operating room just as Marcus was stabilizing Ethan's bleeding. "Tate," he roared, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "You're done. You're throwing your career away for this." His eyes landed on Jamal, and his sneer deepened. "And who's this? Some street kid you dragged in? This is a hospital, not a charity case." Jamal froze, the weight of Hayes's words hitting like a punch. Street kid. He'd heard worse, but not like this, not while he was holding a tray of instruments, trying to save a life. Marcus didn't flinch. "Get out, Hayes," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This boy's doing more for your patient than you ever will." Hayes laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You think you can play hero? You're nothing here, Tate. And this kid? He's nobody. You're both finished." He reached for his phone to call security, but Jamal stepped forward, his fear burning into something else, something fierce. "I'm not nobody," Jamal said, his voice shaking but clear. "I know what you're doing. You're letting that boy die because of who his dad is. Because Dr. Tate's black. Because you think you can." He pointed at Ethan, still unconscious on the table. "He's alive because of us. Not you." Hayes's face twisted, but before he could respond, the monitors beeped a steady rhythm. Ethan's vitals were stabilizing. Marcus's hands, steady as stone, had done the impossible. He'd stopped the bleeding. The room fell silent, the weight of what they'd done sinking in. Hayes's phone slipped from his hand, his authority crumbling in the face of a miracle. But the fight wasn't over. Security was coming, and Marcus knew the cost of their defiance. He looked at Jamal, pride and fear warring in his eyes. "You did good, kid. But this is gonna get ugly." Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. He wasn't running. Not now. Not ever. They'd saved Ethan, but the real battle against the hospital, against the hate that had tried to stop them, was just beginning. The hours that followed were a blur. Ethan's condition stabilized, and word of the rogue surgery spread like wildfire. Richard Caldwell arrived at dawn, his face a mask of gratitude and fury. He demanded answers, but not from Marcus or Jamal, from Hayes. The administrator's excuses unraveled as Caldwell's lawyers descended, threatening to tear the hospital apart. The media caught wind, and soon, the story of a black doctor and a teenage boy defying a corrupt system was everywhere. Marcus faced a disciplinary hearing, but the public outcry was deafening. Protesters gathered outside the hospital, chanting for justice, for Marcus, for Jamal. The boy who'd slipped into scrubs and risked everything became a symbol of hope, his face plastered across news feeds with headlines like, "Teen Hero Saves Millionaire's Son." But Jamal didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a kid who'd done what was right, even when the world told him he couldn't. In the weeks that followed, Marcus was reinstated, his record cleared. Caldwell, humbled by his son's survival, funded a scholarship in Jamal's name, ensuring the boy could chase his dream of becoming a doctor. But the real victory wasn't the money or the headlines. It was the moment Jamal looked at Marcus, saw the pride in his eyes, and knew they'd fought the same fight against a world that tried to make them small. Ethan woke up 3 days later, his memory foggy but his gratitude clear. He didn't care about the politics or the prejudice that had nearly cost him his life. He cared about the man and the boy who'd refused to give up. In a quiet hospital room, with the morning sun cutting through the blinds, Ethan shook Jamal's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice weak but sincere. "You didn't have to do this." Jamal shrugged, a small smile breaking through. "Yeah, I did." The hospital room where Ethan Caldwell lay recovering was a stark contrast to the chaos of that fateful night. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting soft stripes across the white sheets. Jamal Carter sat in a plastic chair by the window, his mother's medical textbook open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. His mind was elsewhere, in the disciplinary hearing for Dr. Marcus Tate, on the news vans parked outside, on the weight of what he'd done. At 15, he'd saved a life, but the world outside wasn't celebrating. Not entirely. Marcus had been reinstated, but the hospital's board wasn't happy about it. They'd caved to public pressure, not conviction. Administrator Gerald Hayes was still in his corner office, his influence untouched, whispering to his allies about reckless vigilantism. The media had split down the middle, half called Jamal a hero, half questioned how a black teenager had been allowed in an operating room at all. Social media was worse. Comments under news articles ranged from praise to vile slurs, with some calling for Jamal's arrest for practicing medicine without a license. The hypocrisy burned. They'd saved Ethan, but to some, that didn't matter. Jamal's skin did. Jamal's mother, Letitia, was a storm of emotions when she'd found out. She'd grounded him for a month, her voice shaking as she yelled, "You could have gotten yourself killed, or worse, arrested." But later, in the quiet of their apartment, she'd hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "But don't you ever do that again." Jamal didn't promise her that. He couldn't. Something had changed in him that night, a spark that refused to dim. Marcus, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle. The hospital board had cleared his record, but they'd made it clear he was on thin ice. Every surgery he performed now was scrutinized, every decision questioned. He'd been a surgeon for 20 years, but to them, he was still the affirmative action hire who dared to defy orders. He didn't care. What kept him up at night wasn't the threat to his career, it was the system that had forced a kid like Jamal to step up in the first place. A system that let politics and prejudice decide who lived and who died. Ethan's recovery was slow but steady. He'd lost some memory of the accident, but he remembered Jamal's face, the boy who'd been there when the world had given up on him. Richard Caldwell, Ethan's father, was a changed man. The millionaire who'd once thrown his weight around to get what he wanted was now using it to protect Marcus and Jamal. He'd hired a legal team to shield them from any fallout, and his public statements were unequivocal: "My son is alive because of Dr. Tate and Jamal Carter. This hospital owes them everything." But Caldwell's gratitude couldn't erase the tension in the city. The story had ignited a firestorm of debate. Protests outside the hospital grew louder, with signs reading, "Justice for Marcus" and "Stop killing black patients." Counter-protesters showed up too, claiming the hospital was being unfairly targeted, that Marcus and Jamal had broken the law. The racial divide was impossible to ignore. Online, hashtags like Hero Jamal clashed with hospital rights, and the arguments grew uglier by the day. Some saw Jamal's actions as a triumph of courage, others saw them as proof that kids like him didn't belong in places of power. Jamal tried to stay out of it. He went back to school, kept his head down, ignored the stares from classmates who'd seen his face on the news. But the world wouldn't let him fade. Reporters camped outside his apartment, and a local activist group invited him to speak at a rally. He said no, public speaking wasn't his thing, but the invitation stuck with him. People wanted him to be a symbol, a voice. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. All he'd wanted was to save a life. Marcus, on the other hand, leaned into the fight. He started meeting with community leaders, pushing for reforms in the hospital's policies. He wanted transparency. Why had Ethan's case been abandoned? Who had given the order to stand down? He knew Hayes was at the center of it, but proving it was another matter. The administrator was slick, always one step ahead, his allies closing ranks. Marcus didn't have the evidence, but he had something stronger, the truth, and a growing number of people willing to listen. One evening, Marcus invited Jamal to the hospital's rooftop, a quiet spot away from the chaos. The city skyline stretched out before them, lights twinkling against the dusk. "You know why I brought you up here?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but heavy. Jamal shrugged, kicking at a loose pebble. To talk about what happened. To talk about what's next. Marcus leaned against the railing, his eyes on the horizon. You didn't just save Ethan that night. You showed the world what's possible when you don't give up. But this fight, it's bigger than one surgery, one kid. It's about every patient who gets written off because of who they are, or who's fighting for them. Jamal nodded, but his stomach twisted. He wasn't a leader, not like Marcus. He was just a kid who'd read too many medical books. What if I mess it up? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I can't be what they want? Marcus turned to him, his gaze fierce but kind. You don't have to be what they want. Be what they need. Someone who shows up. Someone who fights. That conversation stayed with Jamal. He started small-talking to his classmates about what had happened, sharing his story at a school assembly. His words were clumsy at first, but they were honest. Kids listened. Teachers listened. Even the ones who doubted him before started to see him differently. He wasn't just the kid from the rough side of town anymore. He was the kid who'd saved a life. Meanwhile, Ethan was grappling with his own role in the story. He'd grown up privileged, insulated from the struggles Jamal and Marcus faced. But lying in that hospital bed, hearing the whispers of what had happened, changed him. He started visiting Jamal's neighborhood, not as a savior but as someone who wanted to understand. He met Letitia, thanked her for raising a son like Jamal. He sat in on community meetings, listening to stories of people who'd been denied care, who'd been treated like they didn't matter. It shook him. For the first time, he saw the world through eyes that weren't his own. Caldwell's influence helped, but it was Jamal and Marcus who became the heart of the movement. They spoke at rallies together, their voices a powerful contrast, Marcus's steady, commanding presence and Jamal's raw, youthful passion. They didn't just talk about Ethan's case, they talked about the patients who didn't make the headlines, the ones who died because of negligence or bias. They called for accountability, for a hospital board that reflected the community it served, for policies that put patients over profits. The turning point came when a whistleblower from the hospital and nurse who'd worked under Hayes came forward with documents. They showed emails where Hayes had instructed the surgical team to prioritize less controversial cases over Ethan's, citing resource allocation. It wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate. The news broke, and Hayes was forced to resign. The hospital board, under pressure, agreed to an independent investigation. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. Months later, Jamal stood at a podium in a community center, his hands gripping the edges as he faced a crowd of hundreds. He wasn't nervous anymore, not like he used to be. He told the story of that night, of sneaking into the hospital, of the fear and the hope that had carried him through. He talked about Marcus, about his mother, about the system that had tried to break them all. We saved one life, he said, his voice steady. But there are so many more out there. We can't stop now. Ethan was in the audience, his scars still visible but his smile wide. He'd started a foundation with his father's money, funding medical training for kids like Jamal, kids who'd never had a shot before. Marcus stood beside him, his arms crossed, a quiet pride in his eyes. They'd done more than save Ethan, they'd sparked a movement. The city was still divided, the wounds of prejudice and mistrust still raw. But for every hateful comment, there was a voice of support, a hand extended, a step toward change. Jamal and Marcus weren't naive, they knew the fight was far from over. But they'd shown what was possible when courage met compassion, when a kid and a doctor refused to let hate win. What do you think? Where does justice lie in a story like this? Share your thoughts on right, wrong, and the conflicts that divide us.